The movie begins with a white-haired girl walking on a strange deserted road in the middle of the night. She is following a man who keeps walking briskly and calls out to him as Dad. They near an isolated house, and she is startled to see 4 people looking out at her with wide open eyes. As she enters the house, the man disappears and she is left alone in a strange place that has a mirror inside. She looks at the mirror, when suddenly a voice compels her to pick up a shard of glass and the poor girl looks back to find several black-clothed girls holding mirrors before their faces. The scene changes and the same girl whimpers, lying in bed with black liquid pouring out of her mouth. Her worried mother comes near her, and it turns out it was just a nightmare. The next day we see 2 women sitting in a shop, conversing warmly with each other. One is named Ezra, while the other is named Ebru. Ezra is the girlfriend of Ebru's brother Salim. Ebru talks to her and asks her to spill the beans about their relationship. The woman gets a bit shy and tells her that Salim has arranged a surprise for her. Ebru cheerfully talks to her about how happy she is for them, and how Salim was depressed due to their mother passing away, but now he is getting better. Ezra strangely gets lost mid-conversation. Her eyes get blurry and she zones out. Ebru calls out to her and lightly touches her knee to get her out of her trance. The poor woman apologizes for losing track of their conversation due to being tired. Suddenly Salim calls, and Ezra picks up the call. He affectionately reminds her of their planned date. The other woman looks ecstatic for her brother's growing bond. The woman seems to like Ezra a lot and wants her brother to get married to her. On the other side, inside a house, we see the white-haired girl who is named Hale. She is talking to her doll, telling her that she is ugly and she doesn't like herself. Creepily enough, the doll talks back, comforting the little girl. The little girl confides in the strange voice and tells it her secrets and everything. She tells it about her dream and her father. The voice pretends to understand her pain and agrees with her that the man in the dream was indeed her father, but since her father left home before she was born, that is why nobody believes her. The voice then compels her to cut off its fingers, in compensation for telling her about her father's whereabouts. She slowly fetches the scissors, and as she cuts the doll's fingers, blood starts oozing out. Terrified, she gasps and moves back, but the blood disappears as soon as it appears. She then demands her father's location, but the cunning voice tricked her. Getting angry, she throws away the doll and starts screaming. In the other room, Hale's mother and grandmother sit, looking depressed. They talk about how the little girl is not feeling well. The atmosphere looks tense, and they look extremely worried. Back at the shop, Arif, the owner, who also happens to be Ebru's husband, leaves and Ezra is left there alone. Suddenly, she hears some chirping noises and gets up to investigate. There, over a Kaleen, she sees a strange insect, and when she observes it closely, suddenly a strange possessed man looking like Salim appears, shrieking at the top of his lungs. She gets terrified and moves back, shaking with fear. Suddenly, a door behind her opens, and she rushes inside in a trance. There, as she looks around, a strange white-haired girl with bruises and blisters on her face appears, telling her to stay away from Salim. Suddenly, the terrifying girl circles her, and she sees an illusion where 3 men stand chanting while she's being enveloped in a strange black wire. Scary faces appear before her, and she soon passes out. A woman called Aunt Fatima comes inside and runs to her rescue. She takes the girl outside and prays for her, while splashing water on the terrified woman's face. Slowly, Ezra comes back to her senses and thanks the older woman. The woman comments that she is affected by evil eyes, so she must pray tonight before going to bed, while tomorrow the woman will carry out a small ritual for her healing. That night, Salim drives to his house, which looks isolated and quite empty. He walks to his bedroom and looks at his mother's portrait hanging on the wall. Suddenly, he hears a strange noise, and when he looks back, he sees the same picture on the ground with insects all over it. As they disappear, the terrified man runs to his side table and takes some pills. Meanwhile, Ezra comes back home and hears her niece Hale crying inside a locked room. Ezra knocks on the door, calling out to her, but the little girl won't listen. Hale's mother opens the next door and calls out to Ezra. She ushers her inside and tells her that the little girl needs a little time alone. Inside, her mother and sister-in-law are sitting, looking worried sick. The old woman murmurs in a strange tone, talking about some men doing strange rituals and sacrificing strange things. Ezra listens to her, but does not dwell on it. She then asks the other woman if Hale has eaten anything. Turns out she hasn't. The old woman starts crying while Hale's mother tells Ezra to go and rest. She will comfort the old woman on her own. Ezra leaves to find Hale standing outside her door, looking eerily calm. The woman warmly takes her hand and goes inside the room, asking her to have a heart-to-heart talk with her aunt. On the other side, Ebru is having dinner with Arif. She tells him how happy she is with Salim and Ezra. She wants the polite woman to quickly join their family. As the woman is cheerfully talking with her husband, she hears a small girl's voice rejecting Ezra. Ebru gets up to go and see. In another room, she finds her daughter Alif looking around, trying to find something. The little girl's head is pushed inside the storage of the dangling ottoman bed. She isn't ready to welcome Ezra to their family. As the woman calls out to her daughter, the heavy mattress suddenly falls down over the little girl. Ebru shrieks in fright, but suddenly her daughter appears beside her. Turns out it was just an illusion. Alif was in the toilet. She complains about her back hurting. The woman quickly looks at her back to find a strange bruise that could have been caused due to the bed. Although she is terrified, she comforts Alif, telling her that it's all right. sleeping peacefully inside his apartment. Salim suddenly wakes up to a strange noise coming from beside him. He looks around to find a little boy crawling back and forth in his room, while a woman sits with back to him, holding a strange sack before her. Her back is burned black. The woman tells the crippled boy, who happens to be Salim's deceased brother, to go over to the man. Salim looks at the happenings before him, terrified, as the crippled boy advances towards the man. Their mother tells Salim that if he marries Ezra, their son will be just like him. The man gasps awake. Turns out it was just a nightmare. He gets up, though, to find the sack lying there on the floor. If it was just a nightmare, how did it get there? Back in Hale's house, we see her grandmother walking in a trance in the middle of the night. She goes downstairs into a storage room, where she lights up a lantern and goes towards an old box. After opening the box, she takes out a black suit and hangs it on the wall. She grabs a dagger, when suddenly the suit turns into her late husband. The old woman looks at the man, her eyes full of hate, blaming him for her son's disappearance and her insanity. The old man keeps chanting about taking someone who is theirs back with them. The enraged woman attacks the suit with the dagger, when the man turns into an evil spirit and shrieks. Back upstairs, Hale suddenly shouts, calling her aunt in the middle of the night. The woman gets worried and quickly follows the noise outside. She hears her niece calling out to her from all around, but cannot make out the exact location of her voice. Suddenly, she hears some rustling noises coming from the plants nearby, and follows the noise. While she is concentrating, the old woman slowly walks with the dagger behind her and goes upstairs. Ezra slowly nears the plants and sees something moving there. She gets even closer and moves the leaves aside to find the head of her niece's doll. As she picks it up, a hand grabs her from inside the plants, and the possessed face of her niece appears. She tells her not to look back, but the woman quickly turns around to find Salim in a deranged and possessed state, shouting at her. Suddenly she hears banging noises, and the woman gasps awake. She hears vigorous knocks coming from outside, so she runs to open the door and finds Hale with her grandmother, who is holding a knife. The little girl tells her that the old woman again went downstairs with the knife, so she brought her back. Ezra ushers them inside. The next day at the shop, Aunt Fatima carries out the ritual using some snake stones to cast off the evil eye. Meanwhile, back in her home, Ebru is again struck with another horrific encounter, where she sees a scorpion crawling over a lift's back. The terrified woman takes her daughter outside and calls her brother. She asks him to come to her house, if he does not have any plans today. Turns out he has to take out Ezra, so they decide to meet another day. That afternoon, we see Hale's grandmother going into the kitchen. She keeps murmuring about something terrible that's going to happen, with a concentrated look in her eyes. The woman turns on the stove and puts a bottle of oil inside a kettle over it. Upstairs, Hale is once again talking to the strange voice which tries to turn her against her aunt. The voice misguides her into believing that her aunt is lying to her and does not love her. Meanwhile, her grandmother takes the boiling pot of oil and goes upstairs, towards the room where Hale is sitting. The little girl is talking to the voice, which tells her how her grandmother wants to slaughter her. The little girl shouts at the voice to stop spewing nonsense, but it keeps chanting that the old woman wants to get rid of Hale. The voice compels the girl into burning the doll's face, so she can show her something. As Hale is doing that, her grandmother enters the room and sees her. The old woman walks towards the little girl, and over her head, Hale looks back. The lookalike Hale then jumps at the old woman, trying to strangle her. The little girl looks on in horror as the voice's premonition comes true. She shakes off the voice and quickly gets up to go and help her grandmother. They slowly head off to find Hale's mother coming back with groceries. She inquires about their whereabouts, but the little girl lies, telling her that they were just taking a walk. That night, Salim takes Ezra out for a date. He shares a few details about his horrifying experience in the past few days. Ezra also chimes in, saying that she has a dark past, but the man brushes it off. He then gives her a ring and expresses his affection. Back home, while her mother is tucking her in, Hale asks her if her grandmother would try to take her life. The flabbergasted woman assures her that she wouldn't, and goes to the next room where the old woman sits chanting how Hale's father ran off and is not coming back. Hale's mother takes out her medication to administer her dose. Back inside the car, on an isolated road, Ezra and Salim sit. Ezra tells him about the horrible experience that her family went through. Turns out, while her brother and her father were having an argument about selling their house, her brother became enraged and took her father's life. He then fled afterwards and has not returned ever since. The man also does not know that he has a child, since he ran off before his wife told him about the pregnancy. Ezra was also in the same room where this incident happened, but she passed out and came back to her senses only after they had moved into their aunt's house with the police. Ever since that incident, they never moved back to the old house. After hearing the distressing story, Salim soundlessly holds her hand, giving her emotional support. Back at home, Hale awakens in the middle of the night. She goes out and looks outside through the window, where she sees Ezra arriving with Salim. Her aunt goes in and takes out the ring that she was wearing. Hale watches her and quickly hides inside the other bedroom. As the woman comes in, the little girl runs out and asks if she can sleep with her. Ezra warmly agrees, and takes her inside her bedroom, where the little girl confesses to her aunt that she is her only friend and that she should never leave her side. Back at her home, Ebru is sleeping soundly when she awakens to strange noises. Her daughter keeps calling out to her in pain, asking for help. She keeps blaming Ezra for putting her through it. Ebru hears her daughter's voice coming from inside one of the drawers. But when she opens it, she finds human teeth buried in sand. The woman shrieks and moves back, when again she hears the voice coming from another drawer. She opens it to find terrifying eyeballs stuck with needle. Petrified, the woman covers her ears to drown out the voices. Suddenly, she hears her daughter's voice once again, this time coming from inside a cupboard. Ebru opens the cupboard to find a dress covered in blood. The terrified woman quickly turns around to find a possessed Ezra grabbing her hair and pulling her down. Ezra tells her that she is the one who did all this to Alif. The woman finally falls down near her bed, exhausted with fear and shouting in pain. Her husband, now awake, quickly gets up and comes to comfort her. Salim comes back home, tired, and sprawls on the sofa. He turns on the TV and then closes his eyes for a moment. After a while, he gets up and goes to wash his face. In the mirror, he sees one of his eyes turning red. In the middle of the night, he drives with the sack to his shop. There, he puts all the money and the gold from his locker inside the sack. After bringing them back, he throws them inside a lake, while smiling creepily down at the drowning objects. Suddenly, the man gasps awake. Turns out that it was just a dream. But when he looks at his feet, he is wearing his shoes, and the sack is also on the table. Was it really a dream, or is the man slowly going insane? Back in her home, Ezra suddenly wakes up to some whispering sounds. She sees Hale standing in front of the wall, saying something in a different language. Before her, on the wall, strange black liquid is oozing out, with gold ornaments stuck to it. As Ezra nears the girl, she suddenly turns around. In her hand, she's holding her doll, with bleeding guts spilling out. The woman is startled and shrieks. Suddenly, the cupboard door bangs in her face. Hale disappears, and Ezra hears faint whispering noises coming from outside. The startled and terrified woman follows the noise into her mother's room. There, she sees the bloody face of the doll dangling from the roof. She steps inside to find her sister-in-law sitting in a chair, with black liquid dripping down her mouth. The room is littered with dirty clothes, all dangling from the roof. She sees two people sitting on the floor, covered with a white net shawl. Nearing them, she pulls it off, and finds her mother staring back at her. Suddenly, she is approached by a possessed Hale, who tries to attack her. The woman screams and moves back, falling down. Suddenly, everything in the room disappears and it turns pitch black. She shakily exits the room and goes back to her own bedroom to find Hale peacefully sleeping. The next day, Salim goes back to his shop and checks the CCTV cameras to find himself stealing his own gold and money. He consults his friend about the matter, but asks him not to reveal it to anyone else. The man is terrified to the core, as he seems to not remember anything apart from his dream about stealing the things. On the other side, Ebru visits her husband's store where Ezra works, but she ignores the woman and goes inside. Ezra is worried, thinking she has done something wrong. Back at home, Hale again goes downstairs into the room, where she takes out a box from inside the drawer. She opens it to find old photographs of her parents and grandparents. As she is watching them, her mother enters. Upon asking if she's all right, the little girl gets emotional and questions her father's disappearance and her grandfather's demise. Her mother gets sad and lets her be alone for a while. As she goes out, the strange voice appears again, telling her that it would have been better had her aunt disappeared instead of her father. The voice tries to make the little girl go against her aunt, but she adamantly refuses to be compelled and forcefully puts her hands over her ears to drown out the evil and sinister voice. Salim, after getting extremely worried, decides to visit a seer to consult with the matter at hand. He and his friend take the sack with them. They are met with a woman, who puts the sack inside the water and says some chants in an ancient language. Suddenly, an evil face appears in the water and speaks to the woman. The men are ushered outside, where a man approaches them and tells them that they do not have any extra information, except a name that the voices gave them. Back at home, Ezra is tending to Hale when she gets a call from Salim. The little girl asks her not to pick it up, so she leaves the phone and keeps applying ointment on her wounded arms. Afterwards, she goes inside her room to change and calls Salim. The man sounds worried and on edge. He asks her to meet him tomorrow evening, and the startled woman agrees. Salim cuts the call and lays down to sleep. He wakes up to the sound of his name being called. He opens his eyes, but cannot see anything. The man desperately slaps his face, trying to hold on to reality. No matter how much he tries, the hallucinations won't stop. Suddenly, his mother appears beside his bed, yelling that he dumped the gold down the toilet, and his brother, who was crawling around, saw him. The people disappear as soon as they come. Salim quickly gets up and turns on the light, but there's nothing for him to see. He goes inside the washroom and looks at his face in the mirror. Suddenly, there's some rustling behind him. As he turns around, all the gold jewelry is dumped inside the toilet. The man tries to take them out, but suddenly something grabs his hand, and strange hairs start growing around it. He tries to pull his hand out, but to no avail. Suddenly, he hears his mother telling him that she warned him to stay away from her, but he didn't listen. That night, Hale awakens and takes out the picture that she hid under her pillow. As she is looking at it, she suddenly hears strange voices calling in her ears, compelling her to move towards a door. 4 black-clothed evil spirits stand behind her. She moves outside to find all the 4 people inside the picture sitting in the living room in the same pose. The voice pushes her to move near the people. She moves forward, and her mother announces that Ezra is behind her. Quickly turning around, she finds her aunt sitting in a chair and creepily looking back at her. All 4 people suddenly move closer and surround her, enveloping her in pitch black darkness. When they move back, everything around her changes. and she is standing before a huge place guarded by 4 giant evil spirits covered in black cloaks. Hale walks forward, and one of them asks her to enter. The terrified little girl slowly enters the creepy place. Midway, she sees her grandmother shouting at her in a scary voice, telling her to complete what she couldn't. One by one, all her family members except her aunt appear and tell her to move forward and complete her mission. The little scared girl is unaware of what she must do, but she moves on. Suddenly, she hears her aunt's voice calling out to her for help. She follows the noise and comes up to a room with nothing but her aunt, whose face is covered, sitting on a chair. She slowly approaches her aunt and brushes her hand over her head. Suddenly, the view disappears, and she's back inside her aunt's room, standing over her sleeping form and brushing her hand over her head while she is whimpering and moaning in her sleep. Ezra sees strange visions and pictures in her sleep. Scared and terrified, she gasps awake to find Hale standing over her terrified form, comforting her. The two seek comfort in each other's company. The next morning, Hale is sitting all alone in the room downstairs. She scribbles some runes on a piece of paper in a trance. Once she is finished, she takes the paper and goes out. Upstairs, her mother and grandmother are sitting in a room. The older woman keeps whispering under her breath, saying strange things. When her mother comes beside the older woman to inquire, an evil spirit appears and attacks the women, scaring them to death. As Hale enters the room, the spirit disappears. She approaches her mother and hands the paper to her, telling her to cut the thing in it or else she will disappear just like her father. Meanwhile, Ebru and Ezra keep calling Salim, who won't answer. Ezra puts her phone back inside her bag and finds the ring inside. As she takes out the ring, suddenly something pushes her, making her fall on her back. A black hand covers her eyes, and she sees herself in a cave, vomiting out her guts. The strange meat falls down inside the peeled-off face of a strange doll. The illusion ends, and she gasps awake to see the frame of a sacred shrine hanging on the wall before her, shaking violently. That night, she visits the same sacred shrine and offers her prayers. After crying for a while, a sense of peace and serenity envelopes the pitiful woman. Back at home, Hale is peeling off her doll's face with a knife. The strange voice speaks to her, and it turns out that it was the voice that compelled her to give the page to her mother. The voice then reveals that soon, her father will come back home. Suddenly, there is a knock on the door, and when her mother opens it, there's Hale's father standing outside. On the other hand, worried about her brother's well-being, Ebru arrives at his house. She knocks on the door, but there's no response. She then urgently uses her spare key and barges in. There, in the washroom, she finds Salim lying on the floor with a bloody hand, shaking violently. Ebru quickly comes beside her pitiful brother and helps him up, saving him. On the other side, Ezra arrives at her home to find it almost empty. Suddenly, she hears whispers coming from inside, calling her in. As she walks in, she sees her mother and her sister-in-law standing there, smiling creepily. Suddenly, the younger woman tells her that her brother is back. The poor girl happily looks back to see her brother standing there, but he grabs her and forcefully pushes her down on a chair, while her sister-in-law administers an anesthetic on the poor woman. Meanwhile, in the next room, the voice keeps seducing the poor little girl to do as she says, so that her wishes may come true. Back in the other room, the family finally unveil a long-kept secret to Ezra, making the poor woman freeze up in fear. As it turns out, Ezra's father was a sorcerer. He performed dark magic for people for the sake of money. Although he had a black heart, he loved his son dearly. But as fate has its ironic way of turning the wheels, and his son became sick with cancer. The old man didn't want his son to perish, so he made a pact with evil spirits to trade his son's life for his daughter's. In the next examination, it was finally revealed that his son is cured of cancer, so that night, the family decided to perform the ritual and sacrifice Ezra as promised. The man scribbled runes on a piece of paper, the same runes that Hale drew. But the ritual didn't go as planned. Ezra's mother intervened and took the life of her husband instead of her daughter. Soon after that incident, Hale's father disappeared and was never seen again till this day. The evil spirits, as a revenge, took away Ezra's brother because she was not sacrificed as promised. According to the pact, she belongs to them. So now the family decided to carry out the evil ritual so as to be free from the clutches of these dark entities. Pitiful and helpless, Ezra finally passes out after praying earnestly to God for help. In the next room, poor Hale is plagued by the voice that keeps pushing her to take her aunt's life. The adults in the other room make arrangements for the ritual. As her mother is chanting with the rune paper in her hands, Hale enters with a knife in tow. The little girl stands before her aunt. The chants intensify, and as her mother cuts the paper, she whispers to her aunt a final sad, "I love you." Suddenly, chaos erupts. Every mirror in the room breaks, and the chairs in which Ezra and her brother are sitting start floating in the air. Hale, her mother, and her grandmother's face continue to become distorted as they fall down to the floor, taking their last breaths. Suddenly, everything goes dark. Sometimes later, Ezra comes back to her senses to find her niece, her mother, and her sister-in-law all passed away. Hale gave up her life to save her auntie. The movie ends with Ezra praying for Hale's soul. 6 months later, she gets married to Salim, and they have a little daughter who she names Hale. Whereas her brother disappears without a trace once more.